Welcome to Life Stories, where every tale touches the heart and reminds us of the beauty in life's most unexpected moments. Today, we bring you a story of love, forgiveness, and second chances, a story that will leave you reflecting on the power of human connection. What happens when a boy stands in court and claims the judge is his mother? Their journey will move you and inspire you in ways you won't expect. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to start today's story and never miss an unforgettable moment. Let's begin with Life Stories. It was one of those mornings when the air in the courtroom felt heavier than usual. The kind that wraps itself around you like an unseen fog. The wooden benches were packed with people from all walks of life, local reporters, curious onlookers, and a few individuals who seemed to have a personal stake in the case. All eyes were fixed on the defendant's table, where a young boy sat nervously, dwarfed by the oversized chair. His name was Ethan, a 12-year-old with soft brown eyes that carried the weight of a life far older than his years. Ethan looked out of place in the courtroom's solemnity. His hoodie, faded from too many washes, hung loosely on his small frame. His sneakers were scuffed, the kind of wear and tear that told stories of long walks and playground battles. He sat still, gripping the table's edge so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The tension in the room seemed to seep into him, causing his shoulders to hunch as if he was trying to make himself invisible. At the judge's bench sat Linda Carter, a woman known for her sharp intellect and even sharper demeanor. Her name carried weight in this part of Chicago, a no-nonsense judge with a reputation for being particularly strict with juvenile offenders. Her black robe, meticulously pressed, mirrored the precision with which she approached her cases. Her face was a mask of professionalism, betraying none of the emotions swirling inside her. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Carter," the bailiff announced, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. The room rose in unison, a collective movement marked by the creak of wooden benches. Linda entered with the kind of authority that made you instinctively sit up straighter, her eyes scanning the room briefly before settling on the small figure seated at the defendant's table. "You may be seated," she said, her tone crisp. The room filled with the sounds of shuffling feet as everyone settled back down. The case was a straightforward one on the surface. Ethan was accused of trespassing in one of the wealthier neighborhoods of the city, a gated community with well-manicured lawns and security cameras at every corner. The prosecutor began laying out the details, painting a picture of a boy caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. As the opening statement droned on, Ethan's gaze wandered. He glanced nervously around the courtroom, his eyes flitting from the prosecutor to the rows of spectators, and finally landing back on Judge Carter. Something in her face caught his attention, and his expression shifted. His earlier nervousness gave way to a look of recognition so intense it seemed to radiate from his very core. Linda noticed it too, the way his eyes were locked on her, wide and unblinking. At first, she dismissed it as another tactic, a child's attempt to garner sympathy from the bench. But as his stare deepened, she felt a strange unease, a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. "Defendant, is there something you'd like to say?" Linda asked, her voice tinged with impatience. She wasn't one to tolerate theatrics in her courtroom. Ethan hesitated, his small hands clutching the table even tighter. The room fell silent, the kind of quiet that feels like it's holding its breath. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper but loud enough to carry. "I know you," he said, his words trembling but deliberate. Linda frowned, her pen pausing mid-note. "Excuse me," she said, her tone sharper now, cutting through the tension. Ethan's chest rose and fell as he steadied his breathing. "You're my mom," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of the declaration. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, an audible wave of disbelief that swept over the crowd. Linda froze, her pen slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the desk. For the first time in her career, she looked visibly shaken. "What did you just say?" she asked, her voice lower now, almost trembling. Ethan's eyes filled with tears, but he held her gaze, unwavering. "You're my mom," he repeated, his voice raw and filled with a kind of pain that seemed far too big for his small body. The room erupted into whispers. Someone in the back muttered, "Is this for real?" Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, sensing the kind of story that would make headlines. Linda felt the walls of the courtroom closing in. Her breath quickened as she stared at Ethan, searching his face for something, anything that would make sense of the moment. And then, there it was. A flicker of familiarity, a haunting resemblance to a chapter of her life she had worked so hard to bury. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered. But even as the words left her lips, she knew they rang hollow. Ethan's small voice cut through her denial. "You gave me away when I was a baby. My foster mom told me everything." The words hit her like a blow to the chest. Memories she had spent years locking away began to resurface. Unbidden and relentless. Linda felt her composure cracking, the carefully constructed walls of her professional persona beginning to crumble. "I need a moment," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor as she fled to her chambers, leaving the courtroom buzzing with speculation. Inside her chambers, Linda pressed her hands against her desk, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The image of Ethan's tear-streaked face replayed in her mind like a haunting melody. The courtroom, the spectators, the charges against him, none of it mattered anymore. All she could think about was the boy she had left behind, now sitting in her courtroom and unraveling the life she had built. Linda's chambers were eerily silent, a stark contrast to the chaos she had left behind in the courtroom. She leaned heavily on the edge of her desk, her fingers gripping the polished wood as though it could ground her against the storm raging inside. Her breaths came in sharp bursts, her heart pounding like a relentless drum. Ethan's words echoed in her mind, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. "You're my mom." She closed her eyes tightly, willing herself to push the memories back down where they belonged. But they surged forward with a vengeance, the arguments with her parents, the suffocating shame, and the tearful day she had signed the papers that severed her connection to the tiny baby she had held for only a few hours. She had told herself then that it was the right thing to do, the only thing to do. But now, faced with the boy who had grown from that baby, all her justifications felt hollow. A soft knock at the door startled her. Linda straightened, hastily wiping at the corners of her eyes. "Judge Carter," a familiar voice called from the other side. It was Michelle Thompson, the social worker who had facilitated Ethan's adoption all those years ago. Linda hesitated for a moment, then cleared her throat. "Come in." Michelle entered, her face lined with age and weariness but still radiating a quiet strength. She closed the door gently behind her and stood silently for a moment, studying Linda with a knowing gaze. "I was in the gallery," Michelle said softly. "I thought you might need someone to talk to." Linda let out a bitter laugh. "Talk to? About what?" "The fact that a child I gave up for adoption just walked into my courtroom and turned my life upside down?" Michelle's expression didn't waver. She stepped closer, her calm presence a stark contrast to Linda's spiraling emotions. "I remember the day you signed those papers," Michelle began. "You were just a scared 18-year-old. Doing what you thought was best. But I also remember how hard you cried. You weren't just scared, you were heartbroken." Linda turned away, unable to meet Michelle's eyes. "Heartbroken or not, I still walked away. And now I don't even know how to face him." "You don't have to have all the answers," Michelle said gently. "You just have to show up." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Linda sank into her chair, her hands trembling as they clasped together in her lap. "He hates me," she whispered. Michelle shook her head. "He doesn't hate you. He's hurt, confused, and searching for something he's been missing his entire life. And right now, you have the power to give him that." Linda closed her eyes, the weight of Michelle's words pressing down on her. She had spent years burying her past, convincing herself that the life she had built as a respected judge was separate from the choices she had made as a scared teenager. But now, with Ethan sitting just outside these walls, that separation felt like a lie. Another knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. This time, it was the bailiff. Judge Carter. The courtroom is waiting. Linda hesitated, her hand hovering over the desk where her gavel rested. For a brief moment, she considered walking out of the courthouse entirely, retreating into the safety of her carefully constructed life. But then she thought of Ethan, his trembling voice, his tear-filled eyes, and the quiet desperation in his words. "You're my mom." She stood, smoothing the front of her robe with trembling hands. Michelle placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Whatever happens, just be honest. He deserves that much." With a deep breath, Linda stepped out of her chambers and back into the courtroom. The buzz of whispers quieted instantly as every eye turned to her. She walked to the bench, her movements steady despite the turmoil within. Ethan was sitting at the defendant's table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His face was pale, his eyes red, but there was a flicker of hope in his gaze that made her chest tighten. "The court is back in session," Linda announced, her voice firm but carrying an edge of vulnerability. The prosecutor hesitated, glancing at Linda nervously. "Your Honor, given the unusual circumstances, I think it's appropriate to confirm the defendant's statement. Is there any merit to his claim?" Linda's heart pounded as she glanced at Ethan. His eyes were locked on hers, pleading silently for an answer. She opened her mouth to respond but found that the words caught in her throat. Before she could speak, Ethan stood abruptly, his small frame trembling with emotion. "It's not a claim," he said, his voice breaking. "It's the truth. You're my mom. Why won't you just admit it?" Gasps rippled through the crowd again, but Linda barely heard them. All she could see was Ethan, vulnerable, desperate, and holding on to a hope she wasn't sure she could live up to. Her voice trembled as she finally spoke. "This is not the time or place for this discussion," she said, her tone faltering despite her effort to maintain authority. Ethan's voice rose, cutting through the silence. "You don't get to ignore me. You don't get to pretend I don't exist." The room erupted into chaos, but Linda couldn't take her eyes off Ethan. His words hit her like a tidal wave, shattering the last remnants of her carefully built facade. She started. But the words failed her. She turned abruptly, signaling for a recess as she fled back to her chambers. Behind her, Ethan slumped back into his chair, his face a mix of anger and heartbreak. In the quiet of her chambers, Linda pressed her hands to her face, tears slipping through her fingers. For the first time in years, she felt the full weight of her past pressing down on her, and she wasn't sure how to carry it. Linda sat in her chambers, the heavy oak desk in front of her offering little comfort against the storm raging within. Her hands were pressed against her temples, her mind spinning with thoughts she couldn't control. Ethan's words echoed over and over, "You're my mom. Why won't you just admit it?" She had built a life that didn't allow for interruptions from the past, a life of rules, justice, and order. Yet here it was, unraveling in front of her. The image of Ethan's tear-streaked face haunted her, each tear a painful reminder of the choices she had made all those years ago. A quiet knock interrupted her thoughts. "Judge Carter." "It's Michelle again," came the soft voice of the social worker. Linda hesitated but finally called out, "Come in." Michelle entered, her expression a mix of empathy and determination. "You're not going to get through this by hiding," she said gently, taking a seat across from Linda. "Ethan doesn't need perfection from you. He just needs the truth." Linda let out a shaky breath. "I don't even know where to begin. How do I explain to him that I wasn't ready to be a mother? That I thought giving him up was the best thing for both of us?" "You start by being honest," Michelle replied. "It's not about justifying the past. It's about letting him know that he mattered, even when you felt you couldn't be there for him." Linda looked down at her hands. which were trembling slightly. "He's so angry," she said. "And he has every right to be. I don't know if I can face that." Michelle leaned forward, her tone firm but kind. "Linda. He's angry because he's hurt. For 12 years. He's been searching for answers, for a connection. He's not asking you to undo the past. He's asking you to show him that he's not invisible to you." The words hit Linda with the weight of a truth she couldn't ignore. She had spent so long convincing herself that her decision had been for the best. But now, faced with the boy she had left behind, she realized that her absence had created a void she might never be able to fill. A second knock came. This one firmer. It was the bailiff again. "Judge Carter. The courtroom is waiting," he said through the door. Linda nodded. Standing slowly, she smoothed the front of her robe and looked at Michelle. "What if I can't fix this?" Michelle gave her a small, encouraging smile. "You don't have to fix everything today. You just have to show up." With those words echoing in her mind, Linda returned to the courtroom. The air was thick with anticipation as she walked to the bench. Ethan sat at the defendant's table, his small frame tense, his hands gripping the table's edge. His eyes met hers, filled with a mix of defiance and pain. "The court is back in session," Linda announced, her voice steady, though her heart felt anything but. The prosecutor cleared his throat, glancing nervously at Linda. "Your Honor, I believe it's important to address the defendant's earlier statement. If there's any truth to it." "That's enough," Linda interrupted, her tone sharper than she intended. "This courtroom is for addressing legal matters, not personal claims." Ethan stood abruptly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "It's not a claim, it's the truth." Gasps rippled through the gallery as Ethan's voice rose, filled with years of pent-up frustration. "You don't get to hide behind that bench and pretend I don't exist." Linda's composure cracked as the boy's words hit her. For a moment, she stood frozen, the weight of his accusations pressing down on her. Then, she did something she had never done before. She stepped down from the bench. Walking toward Ethan, she felt the eyes of everyone in the room on her. But she didn't care. Her focus was solely on the boy standing before her, his small frame trembling with emotion. She knelt down slightly to meet his eye level, her voice trembling as she said, "Ethan, this isn't the place to have this conversation. But I promise you, we will have it. You deserve the truth. And I won't run from it anymore." The courtroom was silent, the tension almost unbearable. Ethan stared at her, his expression softening just slightly. "You promise?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Linda nodded, tears threatening to spill over. "I promise." With that, she declared the court in recess once again and instructed the bailiff to clear the gallery. As the room emptied, she and Ethan remained, their eyes locked in a moment of fragile understanding. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a beginning. For the first time in years, Linda felt the walls she had built around her heart start to crumble, not out of weakness, but out of the courage to face the truth. The courtroom was silent now, the heavy doors closing behind the last of the spectators. Only Linda, Ethan, and Michelle remained. Linda stood frozen, staring at the boy who had unraveled her carefully guarded past. Ethan sat at the defendant's table, his small hands clasped tightly together. His earlier defiance had waned, replaced by a vulnerability that made him seem even younger than his 12 years. Michelle broke the silence, stepping forward with the gentle authority of someone who had spent decades navigating difficult conversations. "Why don't we move somewhere private?" she suggested, her voice soft but firm. Linda nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She gestured toward the conference room adjacent to the courtroom. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his gaze flickering between Linda and Michelle, before finally rising to follow. The conference room was stark and utilitarian, its white walls and simple furniture offering little comfort. A single table sat in the center, with two chairs facing each other. Ethan took a seat, his movements tentative, while Linda lingered by the door, her hand resting on the handle as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. "You can sit down," Ethan said quietly, his voice cracking slightly. It wasn't a command but an invitation, spoken with a mix of uncertainty and hope. Linda swallowed hard, her legs feeling heavy as she crossed the room and lowered herself into the chair across from him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, filled with unspoken questions and years of pain. Finally, Ethan broke the silence, his voice trembling. "Why did you give me away?" he asked, his words heavy with the weight of a lifetime of wondering. Linda's breath caught in her throat. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. His deep brown eyes, so full of hurt, reminded her of the tiny baby she had held in her arms all those years ago. A baby she had convinced herself she wasn't ready to raise. "I was young," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was just 18. I didn't know how to be a mother. My parents, they told me it was the only way forward. They said you would have a better life without me." Ethan blinked, his expression a mix of anger and sadness. "A better life," he echoed, his voice rising. "You thought foster care was better? Being shuffled from house to house, wondering if anyone would ever want me? That's what you thought was better?" Linda flinched, his words cutting through her like a blade. Tears filled her eyes as she shook her head. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't know that's what would happen to you. I thought you'd be adopted by a family who could give you everything I couldn't. But you didn't check," Ethan said, his voice shaking with anger. "You didn't come back. You didn't even try." Linda wiped at her tears, her heart breaking with every word. "You're right," she admitted. "I didn't. I was scared, too scared to face what I had done. I thought if I stayed away, it would make things easier for you and for me." Ethan's hands clenched into fists on the table. "Do you know what it's like to wait for someone who never shows up?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Every time I got sent to a new home, I thought, maybe this is the one where she'll find me. But you never came." Linda couldn't hold back her sobs anymore. She buried her face in her hands, the weight of her choices crushing her. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I'm so sorry, Ethan. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong. I failed you." Ethan stared at her, his expression softening ever so slightly. For years, he had dreamed of this moment, imagining what he would say if he ever met his birth mother. But now that she was here, broken and remorseful in front of him, the anger he had clung to began to waver. "Do you even care now?" he asked, his voice quieter. "Or am I just another mistake you're trying to forget?" Linda looked up, her tear-streaked face full of anguish. "Of course I care," she said, her voice firm despite the tremble in it. "You were never a mistake, Ethan. Not for 1 second. I've thought about you every day of my life. I didn't know how to fix what I'd done." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Ethan's shoulders slumped, his anger giving way to exhaustion. "I don't want to hate you," he said softly, "but I don't know how to forgive you either." Linda reached out hesitantly, her hand trembling as it rested on the table between them. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said. "But if you'll let me, I want to be here for you now. I can't change the past, but I can be part of your future if that's what you want." Ethan stared at her hand for a long moment, his own hands twitching as if he wasn't sure what to do. Slowly, cautiously, he reached out and placed his hand over hers. "I don't know if it's enough," he said quietly. "It's a start," Linda replied, her voice full of hope. For the first time, a fragile connection began to form, a tentative step toward healing what had been broken for so long. The days following that conversation were like navigating uncharted waters for both Linda and Ethan. The conference room had been a turning point, a moment when the walls between them had started to crumble. But the path forward was far from simple. The wounds between them ran deep, and neither knew exactly how to bridge the gap. Linda was determined to try. After their emotional confrontation, she had spoken with Michelle, who had been instrumental in guiding her through the tangled emotions that had resurfaced. It was Michelle who suggested that Linda and Ethan meet regularly, not in sterile courtrooms or official settings, but in neutral, comfortable places where they could talk and begin to understand each other. Their first meeting was at a small park not far from the courthouse. Linda arrived early, sitting nervously on a bench near the playground. She clutched a paper bag filled with sandwiches and drinks, her fingers fidgeting with the bag's edges as she rehearsed what she might say. Ethan arrived a few minutes later, his steps hesitant as he approached her. He was dressed in the same oversized hoodie and scuffed sneakers, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Hi," Linda said softly, rising to greet him. "Hi," Ethan replied, his voice barely audible. He sat down on the bench, leaving a noticeable gap between them. For a while, neither spoke. The silence stretched between them, awkward and heavy, filled with unspoken questions. "I brought lunch," Linda finally said, holding up the bag. "I wasn't sure what you'd like, so I guessed." Ethan glanced at the bag, then back at her. "Thanks," he muttered. Taking it cautiously, he pulled out a sandwich and unwrapped it slowly, as if buying time to figure out what to say. Linda watched him, her heart aching at how guarded he seemed. "Ethan," she began, her voice gentle. "I know this is hard. It's hard for me, too. But I want you to know that I'm here however you need me to be. We don't have to figure it all out today." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He took a bite of his sandwich, chewing slowly as if considering her words. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "Why now?" he asked. "Why did you come back now? After all this time?" Linda sighed, the weight of the question pressing down on her. "Because you found me," she said honestly. "For years, I told myself that staying away was the best thing I could do for you. I thought I was protecting you. But I see now that I was wrong. And when you stood in that courtroom and looked at me the way you did, I couldn't run from it anymore. I couldn't run from you." Ethan looked down at the sandwich in his lap, his shoulders slumping slightly. It doesn't make sense," he said. "You gave me up. You left me. And now you're here, saying you care. How am I supposed to believe that?" Linda felt tears prick at her eyes. "I don't expect you to believe me right away," she said, her voice trembling. "But I'm here because I want to make things right. I can't change the past, Ethan. But I can show you that I care now. And I hope that someday you'll believe me." Ethan glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I'm still mad," he admitted. "I don't know if I'll ever stop being mad." "That's okay," Linda said gently. "You're allowed to be mad. You've been through so much. And I can't blame you for feeling the way you do. I just hope you'll let me be here while you figure it out." For the first time, Ethan's guarded demeanor softened just a little. He nodded. A small, hesitant motion, but one that felt monumental to Linda. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't acceptance, but it was a start. In the weeks that followed, their meetings became more frequent. Sometimes they went for walks. Other times they sat and talked, their conversations gradually becoming less strained. Ethan began to share pieces of his life stories about the foster homes he had lived in, the friends he had made and lost, and the dreams he had for his future. Linda listened intently, soaking in every word as if trying to make up for all the moments she had missed. In turn, Linda began to open up about her own life. She told Ethan about her struggles as a young girl, her journey to becoming a judge, and the regret that had haunted her for years. Each story she shared was a small step toward rebuilding the trust that had been lost. One afternoon, as they sat on a park bench watching the sun dip below the horizon, Ethan turned to her and asked, "Do you ever think about what it would have been like if you kept me?" Linda took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Every single day, she admitted. But I can't change what I did back then. All I can do is try to make things right now. Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I'm still mad sometimes, he said. That's okay. Linda replied. I just hope that someday you'll let me earn your trust. Ethan didn't respond. But when he glanced at her, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward together. The months that followed were a delicate dance. A slow process of learning and unlearning for both Linda and Ethan. Their meetings continued, each one a step toward bridging the gap that years of separation had carved between them. Yet, the journey was far from easy. Trust, as Linda quickly realized, was not something she could demand, it was something she had to earn. One small gesture at a time. Linda made a conscious effort to show up for Ethan in ways she hadn't before. She attended events at the youth center he frequented, quietly sitting in the back as he played basketball with his friends. The first time she came, Ethan had looked surprised, even embarrassed. But when she cheered for him after a perfect shot, a shy, almost reluctant smile had crossed his face. It was a small moment. But to Linda, it felt monumental, a sign that the walls between them were beginning to crack. Ethan, too, began to open up in his own way. During one of their walks, he pointed out a small diner where he liked to grab a cheap burger when he could scrape together enough money. Linda suggested they eat there together. And over greasy fries and milkshakes. Ethan shared stories about his time in foster care. He spoke about the homes that felt cold and unwelcoming, but also about the ones where the families had tried their best. Even if it wasn't enough, Linda listened intently, her heart breaking with every word. But she didn't interrupt. She knew these stories weren't for her to fix, they were for her to hear. One day, as they sat on a park bench watching the kids on the playground, Ethan turned to Linda with a question that had clearly been weighing on him. Why did you want to be a judge? He asked, his tone curious but guarded. Linda thought for a moment before answering. I guess it started as a way to prove to myself that I could make something of my life, she admitted. When I gave you up, I felt like I had failed, not just you, but myself. Becoming a judge felt like a way to take control of my life again, to do something that mattered. But now, I realize that all the success in the world doesn't mean anything if I can't make things right with you. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the playground. I think I get it, he said finally. Sometimes I feel like I have to prove something too. Like, if I do well enough, maybe I won't feel so angry anymore. Linda reached over, hesitating for a moment before placing a hand on his shoulder. It's okay to feel angry, Ethan, she said gently, and it's okay to take your time figuring out what to do with that anger. I'll be here for you, no matter how long it takes. Their bond, while still fragile, began to take root in these small, meaningful exchanges. Linda found herself looking forward to their time together, cherishing every shared moment as a chance to rebuild what had been lost. She worked with Michelle to explore ways she could support Ethan long-term, researching therapy options and programs that might help him navigate the challenges he faced. She even began attending community events, immersing herself in the world that Ethan had grown up in, a world she had been absent from for far too long. But the road was not without its setbacks. There were days when old wounds reopened, when Ethan's anger resurfaced in sharp, cutting words. You can't just show up now and expect everything to be fine, he had said during one particularly heated conversation. You don't get to fix this overnight. I know, Linda had replied softly, her voice steady even as her heart ached. But I'm not going anywhere. No matter how hard it gets, I'll be here. And she was. Slowly but surely, Ethan began to believe her. Their relationship didn't transform overnight, but it grew in small, significant ways. Linda showed up to his basketball games, surprising him with snacks afterward. She helped him with school projects, her background as a meticulous planner coming in handy. Each interaction, no matter how small, became a brick in the bridge they were building together. Months later, they found themselves back in a courtroom, not for a trial, but for a new beginning. The judge presiding over the ceremony smiled warmly as she spoke. "Today, we celebrate a new chapter," she said. "Linda Carter has formally petitioned to take legal guardianship of Ethan Williams, and both parties have agreed to move forward." The room erupted into applause. But for Linda and Ethan, the noise faded into the background. Linda turned to Ethan, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice steady with emotion. Ethan looked up at her, a small but genuine smile breaking across his face. "I think we're going to be okay," he said quietly. Linda nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "So do I." As they walked out of the courtroom together, hand in hand, the past no longer felt like an anchor holding them down. Instead, it had become a foundation, one they could build on together. For the first time in years, they both felt the weight of hope stronger than fear, guiding them toward a future filled with possibility. As Linda and Ethan walked out of the courtroom hand in hand, the air felt lighter, as though the weight of the past had finally begun to lift. Their journey wasn't perfect, nor was it complete, but it was real, a testament to the power of love, courage, and forgiveness. Together, they had found not just reconciliation, but a chance to rebuild, one step at a time. For Ethan, the woman he once viewed as a stranger had become a symbol of hope. For Linda, the boy she thought she had lost forever had given her life a renewed purpose. Their story was no longer one of separation and regret, but of healing and growth, a reminder that it's never too late to reconnect and make things right. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more heartfelt and inspiring tales like this one.